Welcome. It's a great privilege for me today, on behalf of UIB Global, to welcome Dr. Andrew Fischer to this book launch. I think we're quite lucky to have you here, and we will have ample opportunity to engage with your thought-provoking and provocatively entitled book. And for those of you who haven't seen it already, it looks like this, and like the books outside.
This one
so
right
this right here. And it's called Poverty as Ideology. So what will happen here today? First, I will give a slight background to Andrew and his work. And then Andrew himself, actually, we'll hear it from the horse's mouth, will present his own book and its arguments and an outline of its contents. And then the two of us will engage in a dialogue, is what I hope. And then we'll open the floor for comments, questions, devastating critiques, etc. from you, the audience. So that is what will happen here. So a bit about Andrew. He is currently an associate professor of social policy and development studies at the Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. His background, however, is from Canada, and he started his studies at McGill. There he completed both his BA and MA in development economics and politics in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Following his BA and MA studies, it is safe to say he has worked firmly within the world of development work, having, for instance, been logistical and educational coordinator for various NGOs in India and Nepal from 1995 to 2001. Later on, from 2001 to 2005, Andrew worked as an independent researcher and consultant before, in 2005, taking up a post as a teaching fellow at LSE, London School of Economics. Simultaneously, from 2002 to 2007, Andrew worked on his PhD at LSE, delving into Tibet, development, and China, and what one may call dynamics of exclusion. Throughout his career, I think it is likewise safe to say that Andrew's work has been characterized by both a commitment to development and development work, and to research on its complexities and problems. He has also supervised a huge number of PhD students. I think I counted 11.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. A few have passed along. Have graduated. So yeah,
I'm an anthropologist, so my counting is very bad. So
I know currently 9, but yeah, some have graduated.
Okay.
So that's,
yes.
Yeah.
So
right.
there you go.
I haven't actually made the calculation, so that's good.
Okay. And he's also taught a number of courses on poverty, development studies, development policy, development economics. He's also led a very impressive number, I think, of work for instance, UNDP, UNICEF, etc., etc. His work within this field has led him to produce a number of important books. I count 3 monographs and many articles and reports. One of these books is State Growth and Social Exclusion in Tibet, Challenges of Recent Economic Growth from 2005, I think. And there is also another one entitled The Disempowered Development of Tibet and China, a study in the economics of marginalization. Furthermore, Andrew is the current editor of what is one of the premier journals within development studies, namely Development and Change. So some of you might want to stay around until the end to have a chat with him if you have any texts lying about. He has also published some 21 articles in peer-reviewed journals, including World Economy, China Quarterly, Cultural Anthropology, and Journal of International Development. He's also a very active columnist, a blogger, a contributor to policy briefs and reports, as well as someone regularly making himself available to major international news media. And as me, a neophyte on Twitter, I've come to learn.
It's a new thing.
Yeah, it's a new thing. Currently, Andrew leads an ERC starting grant project entitled Aiding Social Protection, the Political Economy of Externally Financing Policy in Developing Countries. So, in sum, I should think Andrew's background speaks for itself as one being extremely well-suited to write a book with this provocative title, Poverty as Ideology. Now, Andrew will present for us some aspects of his book, a book that is, until now at least, the last from the impressive long-standing collaboration between CROP and Zed Books. And CROP is, for those of you who do not know it, the Comparative Research Program on Poverty. And Andrew's book was the winner of the 2015 International Studies in Poverty Prize in this collaboration. And we very much look forward to hearing you present it, Andrew. So the floor, microphone, and everything else is yours.
Okay, well, thank you for the introduction. Well, I think I should speak for about 15, 20 minutes, is that? So maybe
I'll give you a
discipline me, because I could probably just keep talking. So, but essentially the book is, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here. And also for the award, because I think when you write this type of book, which is very much of a conceptual book, sometimes you wonder if you're a bit on sort of out on left field or thinking very strange things that, and to actually win the award, I think was a huge approbation and a huge boost to then finish the book. Of course, it still took me 2 years, but nonetheless, it's to have that type of acknowledgement from such an important research program, international research program, I think is really important for encouraging this type of scholarship. If you believe after listening to this that the scholarship should in fact be encouraged. But the book is essentially what I like to see as a contribution to what I would call the field, or I would like to call the field of critical poverty studies, similar to critical social policy, which is essentially trying to take a deep questioning of the meaning of poverty, and also how meanings of poverty are then used and translated or influencing policy and political positions as well. The sort of the underlying political or ideological positions that inform policymaking, and it's written from an appreciation. It's critically looking also at the measurement project. This whole idea of how we measure poverty. So a lot of the book is concerned, very technically concerned with poverty measurement. I focus on 3 measures of poverty, the 3 dominant ones, one being what I call the money metric approach to measuring poverty, otherwise what some people would call the income approach or the expenditure approach, or the or monetary approach. The other one being the capability approach or multidimensional methods, which are very popular right now. And the third being the social exclusion approach, which I've chosen out of other approaches because I think that informs very much what's now referred to as the inclusive development agenda or the inclusive growth agenda. And so basically how those 3 poverty approaches feed into broader political, ideological agendas and so on. And it's written with an appreciation with the measurement project. Unlike, I think, a lot of post-structuralist and post-development work, for instance, in anthropology or sociology, that I think too quickly dismisses the measurement project as perhaps even out of a fear for the quantitative, or a mistrust for the quantitative, or a type of deep critique of the quantitative, which then rejects measurement, rather than taking that position, making a deep critique of the quantitative, while also appreciating its role in policymaking, in social provisioning, in evaluating needs, and as also a critical component of establishing processes of state formation, of accountability, sort of in citizen-state types of relationships and so on, and how you actually, the measurement can either disempower that or empower it, right? In terms of reinforcing claims making in particular by poor people themselves versus undermining that and disempowering that process, which I think is fundamentally a major concern that underlies the book, although it's very implicit. It comes out explicitly a few times. And so basically the question I ask in the book is and the question I think we've framed here is very much, what do we really know? I mean, there's a lot of claims about poverty, what exactly is happening with poverty, with a lot of authority in terms of this has been the poverty trend over time. When you actually start to really go into detail in terms of our understanding of how poverty is measured, a lot of that starts to fall apart. Our certainty falls apart. And so what do we really know? And then what do the claims of people saying they know mean? Why are they saying what they say? And that's essentially what I'm trying to do in the book. It's not to question the fact that obviously poverty has declined in the long run at least in the most minimalist sense. In if we take the last 100 years of history, I mean, if you take a country like Norway, it's obvious, right? But even if you take a lot of developing countries, there's definitely in the most minimalist sense, we can probably trace some various trajectories of declining poverty and across a variety of different dimensions. But what does that actually mean for people's real experiences, for their subjective and objective perceptions of their quality of life, for instance, right? And the issue is really that I think poverty measurement is a fundamentally political process, and it's fundamentally political because it involves a lot of value judgments and norms, and also I think critically because it brings in the notion of a threshold. That whenever we talk about poverty, we're usually operating with implicitly or explicitly a notion of a threshold of being below or above a certain threshold of what we consider to be a minimally decent standard of whatever dimension we're applying that threshold to, be it monetary or non-monetary or human or other dimensions and so on. And so I think it's really important in that sense because they are based on, they're very political, based on norms and value judgments and so on. It does bring in sort of an ideological element right in the very conceptualization and then measurement of what we're calling poverty in essence. And when I say ideological, what I mean, I don't mean, I refer to various people in terms of an understanding of ideological in a generic sense of basically, as Curtis White, for instance, says, it's the stories we tell ourselves as groups of people or societies in terms of how best to live together. And so it's not necessarily a formally defined ideology as in neoliberalism or whatever. And what he, for instance, states is that ideology has received a bad name because of the abuse of these stories by people in positions of power to their own advantage, right? And hence that's where we get the derogatory meaning of ideology in the modern period. And in this sense, we can definitely think about neoliberalism, for instance, if we wish to use that term, as an ideology. In the sense, it's a set of ideas about how best to order advanced capitalist market societies in the most ethical or meaningful or egalitarian ways, according to a certain set of theoretical principles, which quickly turn into quite ideological principles as well. And then within that, of course, poverty measurement plays a very central role because they set up a politics of what I would say of representation in terms of how do we understand the past. So how do we understand the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, for instance, particularly in this, what we might call the neoliberal period, and whether poverty has been improving or not. And then we're using that then as a litmus test to say, has this period then therefore been good or bad, right, in that sense? But then the problem there is that because poverty measurement is so malleable, it's so sensitive to the value judgments you make, to the thresholds you set, and also to the measure to the measure that you're applying that to, and your conceptions of basic needs and so on. Because those are so malleable and manipulable, it becomes very susceptible to basically manipulating the representation of what has happened in our lives over the last 20, 30, 40 years in that sense, right? I mean, the simplest examples to demonstrate that, it seems these days, the easiest example to give is usually related to this president in this big, powerful country. I believe his name starts with a T or something. And but for instance, I believe it was last year where the Trump administration essentially redefined poverty from the monetary method, which many people critique for better or for worse, into a proxy means tested method, which is actually being, to a large degree, pushed by the World Bank and developed in a lot of developing countries, for lack of a better term, poor countries. Proxy means testing are widely used, for instance, in social protection programs to target people. And they adopted a proxy means test for the US, and by just changing the measure of poverty and the definition of poverty, statistically reduced the measure of poverty from about 18.5 million people, extreme poverty, right? From 18.5 million people to down to, I think, 250,000 people. And then they hence proudly declared that there is no poverty in the US. And of course, this was then tied into the politics of retrenching social welfare, right, basically, and also putting more work requirements on for social welfare recipients and so on. So it then ties into a right-wing agenda of basically having more punitive and disciplinary, basically, workfare or poorhouse type, Victorian-style poverty relief. So that's just a very obvious example of how political these measures can become. But even more generally, obviously, the global debates we've been having in terms of debates about World Bank purchasing power parity poverty measures, PPP measures, is all, I mean, a lot of the controversy is about how those numbers are used to represent, in particular, the last 30 or 40 years of global capitalism, and whether this has been a good experience for the world's poor or a bad experience, and then hence whether we should be concerned about inequality if poverty is falling, right? But then, of course, the issue there is again, what are we talking about? And if the measurement of poverty is so sensitive to slight adjustments in the line, and if we're unable to control for these adjustments accurately, to what degree is sort of the representation of a reduction in poverty actually representing something real in people's lives, or just the inability of, or perhaps the intended manipulation of lines to represent falling poverty, right? As I always like to say, you could have a beggar whose social circumstances essentially have not changed over the course of 20 or 30 years, starting to receive quarters and dollars instead of dimes or pennies. But if you actually don't have a proper adjustment for the poverty line, he might actually appear to be coming out of poverty without anything really substantively changing in his life, for instance. Or other examples, I mean, I often like to refer to also with a historical perspective, like in Latin America, where or in Africa as well, where you have, of course, as probably many of us know, the whole 80s economic crisis, starting with the debt crisis in the early 80s, and very severe, what some would call draconian structural adjustment policies, and with rising poverty at that point. And actually the previous period, despite problems, nonetheless, in the post-war period of the 50s, 60s, 70s, having substantial poverty reduction over that period. And yet there's the whole politics about then in the MDGs and the SDGs, for instance, about the start year of where you start to measure things. Because when they chose 1990 as the start year, even though the declarations were agreed in 2000, they chose 1990 as the start year, you were choosing pretty much about the worst possible point in time for Latin America and Africa in terms of poverty, right? Because actually between the late 70s and 1990, you had quite a serious worsening of poverty in Latin America and Africa over that period. Which is statistically, when we go back into into whatever we can, the statistical data from that period, we can see these increases or stagnating, even increasing mortality rates, for instance, as opposed to preceding reductions in mortality and things like that. But of course, the World Bank PPP, Poverty Measurement Project, doesn't go before 1982. And even in the 80s, the data that they have for doing this very standardized global poverty measurement project is very, very patchy and unreliable. So it's almost because of the data requirements of their own project, they start in 1990. But you can see that leads to a very biased choice, because any progress from that point onwards is then represented as this great progress of basically neoliberal capitalism, for lack of a better term, as opposed to representing, I think a large part of poverty reduction from 1990 up until about the mid-2000s was essentially recovery from previous crisis, right? And particularly in the early 2000s, as soon as you have the loosening of liquidity conditions and economies were basically able to start to revive growth again, you had a natural reduction in various forms of especially income poverty that were really more about recovery than they were about any substantial improvement. I think it's taken 30 or more years for Africa to basically reach the point in proportionate terms at least, where they were in the late 70s in terms of poverty measurement. So are we actually representing the success of post-Cold War sort of liberal capitalism at reducing poverty, or are we actually measuring simply the recovery from a very disastrous period of very severe structural adjustment policy, right, in the 80s? This is a critical question to ask because we are very much entering into this again right now as liquidity conditions, like I've been writing about this in separate articles, where, for instance, we're in the last 10 years in particular, we've been in a period that's very similar to the 70s in terms of extremely loose liquidity conditions, allowing poor countries to start borrowing again, which has been the financial constraint, allowing them to, loosening that financial constraint, allowing them to start to grow again when they're, especially in the sense that growth is dependent on foreign exchange. And in that context, building up a lot of debt loads in a very fragile, vulnerable situation where a slight tightening of the international financial environment, again, could lead to another type of debt crisis as we had in the early 80s. It's something that definitely a lot of people are fearing right now. So in that context, if we celebrate the outcome of that period as one of sort of historic reductions in poverty, or if we actually view the period as having been quite disastrous for a preceding gradual reduction of poverty that got stalled for about 20 or 30 years, that has a huge, how we interpret the history has a huge bearing on how we address the present and near future potential crises facing large parts of the world. So anyways, I don't hope I haven't used up all my time already just saying that, but so it's just to say, why these things are so political. I could give many other examples. Other examples are in the book. Also my work, a lot of it's informed more implicitly than explicitly by my work on China. We could also think about, maybe you've heard in the news about these re-education camps in Western China, in Xinjiang. I wouldn't go into that necessarily, but also a big issue in the Tibetan areas, for instance, have been resettlements to a certain degree voluntary, to a certain degree non-voluntary, but essentially resettling people off the land into urban or in the peripheries of towns, these resettlement camps where often people end up becoming dependent on welfare or not having sufficient employment opportunities and so on. But in that transition from a very subsistence type of agricultural setting to a resettlement camp in a small town, for instance, it could be represented as improving multidimensional poverty, for instance, because the house in the resettlement camp has a cement floor or has a light bulb, as opposed to a tent. And even though they're going from a condition where they have a certain degree of autonomy and subsistence wealth to a condition where they lose most of that and they become quite dependent and vulnerable to then new economic conditions and so on. So the way that poverty is representing these types of transitions over time is also very problematic, right? So those types of things and yet they could be shown as achieving the SDGs and the MDGs and so on. So I think I've made the point that it's very political and very ideological. And so on that, I think I will just quickly summarize. I mean, I say that there's three central arguments that run through the book. And that sort of weave it all together, which maybe you'll refer to more, hopefully.
No weaving.
And all of them are underpinned by this understanding of poverty as being fundamentally relative. And when I mean relative, I don't just mean relative as in relative social norms, as in it depends on how we relatively think of what's a decent quality life or what would be sufficient needs in different contexts. But it's also relative to what I would say, and this is what ties it into an understanding of development, it's relative to processes of structural transformation that fundamentally is what I would refer to as development, right? The most fundamental perhaps is urbanization, or this transition over the last 100 years as what I refer to as sort of a transition from a state of sort of poverty being understood as the sufficient or the insufficiency of subsistence to poverty more in today's world, even in many poor countries, being more represented as scarcity amidst abundance, right? And how that fundamentally alters the equation of how we think of and need to measure poverty, essentially. Where poverty does, I mean, it is deeply related to issues of inequality, as we were discussing before, but but it still needs to be rooted on what I would say compelling social needs, in terms of needs that in the absence, they're not just preferences, or not just because I don't have a TV I feel deprived, but it's actually needs that in the absence of which there's serious deprivations to your various dimensions of your well-being, right? And I think the problem is that as we move out of agricultural settings, more into urban settings in particular, the non-food-based needs in particular become increasingly dominant in this compelling sort of way, in the sense of creating compulsions that drive people into situations of exploitation or subordination or other situations where they have to accept these situations, because in the absence of which they just are seriously deprived in either health care or transport to access employment or other housing as well, and so on. And the fundamental problem, I think, is that a lot of the discussion about poverty for poor countries is still rooted in this conception of absolute poverty, which is essentially a food-based poverty measurement, which is still quite rudimentary in terms of its understanding of non-food-based needs. And essentially, what we're looking at over time is that this way of constructing poverty measurements is making our understanding of poverty in the context of these transformations, these long-run structural social transformations. It's making these measures of poverty more and more, what's the word for it again? More and more. I forgot the word, but anyways, out of date, more and more falling behind the actual development of these compelling social needs that people are actually facing, right? So we're essentially, you're having an undervaluation of people's needs in a context of in these contexts of the social and structural transformation that all societies have been going through. And as a result of which, a long-term chronic underestimation of poverty over time, right? Which I think is for me, I think the most important critique of a lot of the World Bank poverty measures, because I think, I mean, some of my colleagues who I fully agree with their intention and so on in terms of the way they engage in these debates, nonetheless accept the World Bank poverty measures. And they'll say, well, look, the problem is the level of the line. If you put the line at $1.9, you'll get a certain poverty rate. But if you put the line at $7, then you'll get a different poverty rate. So really, it's the issue about where you draw the line. But even in that debate, it's accepting the numbers as it's taking numbers for granted. In fact, that we actually can measure these things. That actually $7 is the same $7 over time that we're talking about, right? Whereas actually it most likely isn't. It's not really an accurate representation of the evolution of people's real social needs over time, right? Which I think in that sense, I don't even refer to World Bank poverty data in the book, because when you actually really understand how they're constructed, it's hard to take them seriously in that sense. So it's a call for a much more grounded and nuanced sociological approach to understanding poverty, in terms of how poverty, the real sort of evolution of people's needs occurs over time, and to bring that back into understanding of poverty. Also other issues in terms of how poverty ties into, for instance, social policy making, or the way poverty and the measurement of poverty ties into targeting, for instance, and targeting agendas, in the sense that a lot of these poverty measurements, even though one might not say that they have a policy bias, they are nonetheless designed as targeting devices, and hence are brought into and operationalized alongside types of social policy that are often quite segregating for populations in terms of dividing out the poor and the non-poor, not just in terms of who receives certain benefits, but also in terms of the provisioning of various social goods like education and healthcare and so on, which is a major concern of mine in terms of how social policy, the mainstream social policy agendas and how they're being pushed in developing countries, what's generally referred to in the debates about targeting and poverty, but targeting and universalism. But I think what's really concerning there, and a tension in a lot of the poverty studies, is a tension between, on one hand, the need to identify needs versus the policy tendency of segregating populations, particularly between the poor and non-poor, or between working classes and middle classes and so on. And this being perhaps one of the most important central dynamics in the history of social policy in terms of moving towards a more progressive, universalistic, egalitarian direction versus a direction that's much more segregationist and disequalizing, and in terms of how different groups of population are treated very differently in terms of social provisioning and so on. And also how that biases also to a certain degree the poverty measurements, because over time, for instance, I mean, I give the example in money metric measures of poverty. If you actually over time say you have the healthcare or education is increasingly commoditized, meaning that it was previously more or less free, but then it becomes more and more expensive over time, because the amount of money people are paying for healthcare, for instance, is included in household surveys, but it's not included in the poverty line for technical reasons, because it becomes almost impossible to measure poverty if you include health and education expenditures, because it's too difficult to control across households. You would have to do an individual poverty line for each individual household, which becomes practically impossible. So as a matter of rule, people don't include it, these very large lump sum investments. But that effectively means that as you're going from a situation like China in 1980 to China in 2010, when education and healthcare costs went through the roof and became extremely commoditized and privatized, or in India, when I was living in India, Apollo Hospital in Delhi was the top hospital, and now today apparently Apollo Hospital is just a mid-range hospital because there's more and more, basically private hospitals coming in, charging higher and higher fees, as high as the market can go, which has a knock-on effect in terms of drawing professional resources out of the public sector and undermining the public provisioning and so on. So in these types of settings, ironically, if people start then spending more and more and more of their income on health care, it could actually be represented as declining poverty, all other things being held constant, right? So you can actually have a bias within the ways we measure monetary poverty, a bias against universal provisioning, or at the same token, if you have a country that provides free healthcare to its population versus a country that has very expensive healthcare, you have a bias against, in the comparison, a bias against the country that's providing the free healthcare, right? So in the sense that the international comparison project that the World Bank leaves, this is a big black box that they don't even consider in the international comparisons, which really puts into question really any of the insights that we can gain from these data over time, or also in a cross-country comparison. So, I mean, those are some of the big takeaway points, but I think as a conclusion, I guess I argue for politicization of the poverty measurement and the poverty studies project, partly because of the importance of understanding these things, but also a way of bringing poverty, the understanding, the measurements of poverty back to a way that it's more accessible to the poor themselves, to and understandable, so that they can also contest the representation of their own poverty, and also use it as a basis of enhancing their claims making with the state and so on. But generally speaking, back to the original question, do we really know what's going on over the last, say, 30, 40 years with poverty? I would say, in a general sense, no. Maybe in a specific sense, in certain contexts, yes. But I think the important thing is that admitting that we perhaps don't know is an important step in pausing and trying and actually allowing us to listen more, rather than just having this extremely dominant approach of the authority from the expert from above, basically not being questioned. So I'll stop there, and then, because I know we're supposed to have a dialogue, and
we're supposed to have Thanks a lot for the presentation.
Thank you.
I think it was a great introduction to your book and to core themes and arguments of your book. And I'm struck reading your book and also hearing you talk now about sort of how closely you relate poverty and the study of poverty to politics. Yeah? And you have many fantastic sections, especially in your introduction or throughout as well, where you're very clear on this. And you also say that you also critique, in a sense, the politics of poverty in your book. And you say, and I quote, that it's so often disguised as science, in a sense. Yeah. So there is the politics of poverty, and there is the politics of poverty disguised as science. But at the same time, poverty is inherently political. Yeah? And you say very clearly that you're not interested in taking up sort of the post-structuralist position, which is sort of endless, if I should be very critical, endless sort of deconstruction of everything. So you're left with nothing, just an apparatus of governance, in a sense, and we're all happy, and there's nothing left. You're not there, and you said we should engage this, and we should also engage this engage poverty as scientists, as researchers. But could you elaborate a bit on how can we sort of maneuver in this heavily politicized space, in a sense? Yeah? What is a good way of engaging with sort of poverty as you see it as researchers? You mentioned, of course, listening to the voices, listening to people. Yes.
No, but that's also been co-opted by
yes, it has.
The World Bank. Yeah. No, I always find it interesting how the World Bank. I mean, I saw it when I was at LSE. I forget what her name is, but it's the main lead author of the Voices of the Poor series of the World Bank. And they said after they did 80,000 interviews of people, and then two main conclusions were the people didn't like the state intervening in their lives, and they wanted more markets. So how conveniently these were the two main conclusions from a massive World Bank study.
The dream come true for the World Bank.
And I know for myself, working in farming rural communities in Tibetan areas in China, for instance, that people, as more of an anthropological approach, people can say very different things depending on how you approach them, right? So people, if they're quite. The Tibetans are a bit, like sort of Texan in their approach to state intervention and the governments and so on. But you would ask them about the taxes. They would say, "Oh yeah, we're being taxed like crazy." And it's like, "Well, how much are you being taxed?" "Well, they take one of our sheep, and how many sheep do you have?" "Well, I have, say, 20 sheep, so we have to give them a sheep a year." "Well, that's a 5% tax rate. I mean, that's pretty good." But but then on the other hand, they would say, "Well, what would you like from the state?" And they want health, they want education, they want all these, state provisioning. That's their, the major issues they're dealing with, right? So, if depending on which way you talk to the person, you can get entirely different understanding of their own ideological, approach to the state, right? In terms of that sense. So,
sorry.
Yeah, but I went on to a distraction there. How do you do it?
No. I was just trying to follow up. Would that also mean that you would need to develop more sort of complex ideas of what you mean by state and state provision? Because it would mean so many different things in so many different places. Also, what a market is.
Yeah, no, exactly. And sorry, I got onto a diversion there just because I heard Voices of the Poor, and then I immediately started thinking about that. But I would say there's two responses to your first question, which is one is in terms of the global debates, how do we engage in the global debates? And I think part of the politicization is about re-embedding our discussion about poverty in terms of development strategy and our understanding, which is a heavily politicized thing as well. Because, and this goes with the issue of inequality too, because when the UN was trying to revive, this is what I talk about in I think chapter 2, the UN was trying to revive attention to inequality. This is before Piketty wrote his book. It was 2012. The Economist magazine came out with a whole special issue on inequality and said, yes, actually we do, with caution, perhaps inequality is a problem, but how do we deal with it? We smash labor unions, because labor unions, they said, is the biggest cause of inequality in the US, far greater than any financier in Wall Street, right? So, because the teachers union obstructs the operation of efficient allocation of resources in education, which blocks poor people from that whole argument, right? So the real question is not whether we say poverty is a problem or inequality is a problem. That doesn't solve, and this is my critique of the MDGs and the SDGs, is that naming the problem doesn't solve how we're then going to address it, right? And then, of course, the fact that the dominant voices then control the measurements of poverty allow them to then massage those measures. I mean, this sounds a bit conspiratorial, but nonetheless, it allows them to present things in the way that supports their agenda, right? And that's one thing. So it's contesting that and bringing us back to not allowing the discussion of poverty or inequality in that sense to be usurped by various agendas that are pushing, but saying, no, actually we need to reclaim that space and understand, first of all, critique the measures, but also understand how the measures are then being used to justify various approaches, right? But also at the local, national level, I think a huge amount of public resources are sidetracked into a lot of these poverty measurements where they would be more usefully applied to more standard classical measurements of social statistical needs evaluations of the population across a whole range of disaggregated statistics, rather than all the resources being concentrated into, say, the construction of a proxy means test, which is hugely criticized. It's very inaccurate. It's not very, but it's also oriented towards a targeting device. So rather than the health system reinforcing traditional census taking, for instance, or annual surveys or accurate surveying of labor forces to measure wages and incomes and employment levels or aspects of informality and so on, a huge amount of limited state resources get sidetracked into the latest multidimensional poverty index, much of which has been severely criticized, as I have done in Chapter 4, in terms of whether it's actually the right measures that we should be focusing on. And the problem, for instance, with the multidimensional poverty index is that in many cases, half the measures that they list that countries should be measuring for their index don't even exist. The countries don't have the data. So then a lot of state resources in the statistical departments, which are already under-resourced, go into collecting those data, whether or not they're the most useful data for the statistical departments to be collecting for, say, the health department or the education department and so on. So these are ways that I think, I work a lot with stats, and I'm a big fan of very disaggregated and textured social statistics to really understand the needs of your population on a broad basis. But a lot of that has been undermined by the diversion of resources into poverty targeting, right? So like in Zambia, for instance, where I was recently doing some field work, it seems that the civil registry only has about 70% of the population, covers about 70% of the population. So on one hand, you have a civil registry, the state doesn't even have a full record of its entire population, and the total population is just estimated. And at the same time, they're developing these social registers to target the bottom 40% of the population, which are then operationalized to then produce social provisioning systems that fundamentally segregate those 40% from the rest of the population. So in this, it's dysfunctional statistical systems in that sense to actually have a proper evaluation of who your population is and the needs that they have in a comprehensive sense, right? So I mean, these are. I hope that answered your question.
Yes,
right?
yes, it did.
Yeah.
Great. There is a subtitle to your book.
Yes.
Rescuing Social Justice from Global Development Agendas. Yeah. And so far, you've been presenting a bit in your book about sort of inequality, poverty's ideology, and I think you're very convincing in terms of poverty as ideology. I buy it completely. What I haven't heard you talk about so far is sort of social justice. Could you say something first about how do you define social justice, and how does it relate or not necessarily relate to poverty? What is social justice to you, and why should we rescue it in a sense? From global development.
No, exactly. Because I think, obviously, I think you probably hit on a point that maybe was less developed in the book in terms of you could have people just writing a whole book on social justice, the meaning of social justice, and so on. And I suppose for me, the understanding of when I use the term social justice, because like neoliberalism and other terms, it gets used in many, many ways, and it probably has a very diffuse meaning in that sense. But the way I understand it fundamentally is about how do we move towards more progressive, egalitarian agendas that are not segregationist, that do not fundamentally treat people in different ways, and the challenge, and this is what I say. I think I mentioned it earlier, but in chapter 7, I start the chapter with this. The fundamental tension is this tension between identification of needs on one hand, versus that identification process being used as a segregation device in social provisioning, right? Where there's a fundamental, tension in that sense of essentially treating the poor differently, right? And it's a tension within liberalism itself, right? Is how do you address the needs of poor people while at the same time treating everyone equally? It's a tension within universal social policy. Is one of the critiques of universal social policy is that if you treat everyone the same, how do you actually address special needs? How do you address the disadvantaged? How do you address the discriminated? So I'm not saying that there's an easy solution to this, but by ignoring those issues, not putting them on the center front on the table, and then just assuming that targeting goods towards poor people is the best use of resources and the best way to address poverty. Whereas I think the big insight from social policy is debated to a certain degree. I think the World Bank is still resistant towards the argument, tries to produce evidence to the contrary. But the basic understanding, one of the lessons out of the political economy of targeting, or the political economy of in social policy, is that the more you target goods towards poor people, you end up with poor quality goods, or you reinforce the separation between the poor and the middle classes in particular, or whatever we call middle classes, the poor and those who the non-poor. And the more you reinforce those lines of segregation and separate the provisioning, the way you treat one group versus the other group, you develop statistical systems that are only addressing one group. You address their needs in a certain way. You put them through, or fundamental different approaches to the social provisioning to the two groups in that sense. I think the more you undermine, you're reinforcing the segregationist bias that I think is unfortunately. I talk about this in the conclusion of the book. I think the big thing that worries me is this rise of segregationism as an accepted norm or second best practice of dealing with immediate needs, with almost using the analogy of humanitarianism to generalize social provisioning in say health, education, and other areas. So in humanitarianism, the humanitarian principle is you have to find the poorest person who's about to die and practice triage and address those most pressing needs now. And so it's the urgency of the humanitarian crisis that drives the triage and the targeting, right? That drives you to figure out who's basically at the point of starvation and severely needs some intervention, right? You apply that generally to society as a whole for regularized forms of social provisioning, as your justification for bringing in these targeting mechanisms, that fundamentally then, especially for poor countries that are in the process of building up, that have been crippled by structural adjustment policies for 10 or 20 years, and are just at the point of now trying to rebuild social protection systems, health systems, education systems, and so on. And then the big pressure for them is to move into this type of segregationist logic in terms of the way they provide goods and develop their systems and so on. I think it's extremely problematic in terms of what I would call that social justice, right? Yeah. But it's not a very precise definition of social justice, but it's an evocation of the term for addressing that.
All right.
Yeah.
Excellent. I think we will open the floor for questions and interventions from the audience now. Yeah, Else. I don't know if there's a microphone, but there is. There's even a big microphone.
Yeah.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Else Owen, and I started CROP 25 years ago. So I have listened to you with great enthusiasm. But I wish you had been older, because then you had been with us at an earlier time.
Well, thank you.
And also, I think if I were to sum up shortly, what is my experience after all these years doing poverty research? it is that I had the wrong focus. We have focused on the poor.
Mm-hmm.
We know enough about the poor now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you could tell me much that I don't know about the poor and the way they've been treated by the non-poor. It's the non-poor. It's the institutions around the poor that we need to study much more systematically than we have done before. It's their opinions, it's their way of using resources, it's their politics that leave a certain part of the population outside that we now say they're the poor. And then we study how the poor live and how awful it is and what their shortcomings is, what would they do with a different kind of system of financing, etc., etc. We know all that, but we know much too little about what is actually going on outside. And that's why I loved your performance, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I thought the butt was going to... Well, thank you. Yeah, that's a wonderful... I mean, I agree entirely with exactly what you said, and I think this is my problem with the behavioralist turn in poverty studies as well. I think in the behavioralist studies, there's, you study the poor to death, how they move, how they, and then you do on top of that, you do these randomized control experiments which are ethically very problematic, because you say, well, give poverty relief to this group for 5 years, not that group, to see how they behave. To see how it somehow improves, but also it reverts the poverty question back to blaming the poor for their poverty, right? Of looking for the cause of poverty and the behavior of the poor and the choices they make and so on, right? And so that's, I mean, I don't go too much in the end into the Flow and Banerjee's work, but I do have a real problem in that sense, and how it also feeds into, although themselves, I'm sure, I don't know, I presume they're Democrat instead of Republican, but how it does feed into a right-wing attitude towards the problem of poverty is from the behavior of the poor, rather than how they're structured within a broader system, right? So yeah, I would agree with that completely.
But you do have an argument towards the end, which fits into your intervention and your reply now as well, where you say, in a sense, that, not directly, perhaps indirectly, that it's important to pay attention to the whole history of how Western powers or how different institutions have dealt historically with the poor. Because there is this, at this juncture, you have the kind of reversion to a Victorian approach to the poor that fits in with the neoliberal forms of governance, which fits into your behavioralism as well. While the neoclassicists had another approach to the poor, in a sense. So I think that's important.
No, I think there's this. I think, and this is I addressed this issue in the conclusion where, because this rise of what I call this rise of segregationism as an accepted norm of how to deal with the poor from the non-poor, is one could argue the same way one looks at the rise of right-wing populism as going against neoliberalism. So this is the end of neoliberalism. This is the death of neoliberalism, because one's focusing on the liberal of the neoliberalism, whereas neoliberalism itself often had within it very strong. It was more about disciplining populations to operate, and so the neoliberal governmentality, so to speak, in terms of disciplining populations to behave as what is conceived to be, well-operating market actors, it comes in very strongly in that segregationism as well. So there's an odd now, it's like a sort of Victorian approach to social policy mixed in with sort of segregationism that I think is...
it's a toxic brew.
It's a very toxic brew. I think we're going into a very problematic period right now, especially that... I think any serious student of social policy should understand as the foundation of their studies this whole debate about targeting and universalism, right? Even though it's maybe a bit old-fashioned, it needs to be updated and so on, we start from that understanding, we can debate it, talk about it, and so on. But I think there's within poverty studies, I think there's an absence of that sort of understanding in the scholarship, where a lot of people, very well-meaning, do really genuinely think targeting is the best way forward. And also another thing, that it's not just the targeting as well, it's also the fact that what we've seen in the last 10 or 20 years, because in my research project we're looking at this more carefully, but it's also this the change in the modality of targeting, where now the best practice of targeting is this very top-down, technocratic, insulated from local politics approach to just selecting people, which completely disempowers the person being selected from understanding the selection process. The big problem with proxy means testing. It's like the poor person has absolutely no idea why they were selected, or maybe it was because they saw I had a light bulb or something, right? But it disempowers also the process of claims making. There's a wonderful Indian political scientist, Neera Chandok, who talks about this in terms of decentralization agendas or the NGOization of development, where it decenters the state and it actually undermines processes of claims making and accountability, the locuses of accountability of the state vis-a-vis of poor people. In the same way that these top-down processes of selection, which are promoted because they're trying to escape problems of corruption, clientelism, and so on, sort of trying to depoliticize the selection process, precisely undermine the abilities of the poor themselves to contest the targeting, or also the subsequent provisioning that they're receiving from the targeting, and so on, right? So all these things I think are coming together. They're accepted as best practices, but they're actually hugely problematic in terms of
Great. Other questions? Maria?
Thank you so much for your talk. I just have a quick question following up on what you just said now, in terms of whether you can expand a bit more on how the SDGs feed into this targeting agenda and how it very politically depoliticizes the policy space and kind of claims making that you would otherwise have nationally.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, first of all, there's the fact that despite the inclusion of some inequality measures and a few other rudimentary measures of employment and so on, that the SDGs basically perpetuate the tradition of the MDGs of accepting 1990 as the start date and World Bank measurement of poverty, which basically lets them sort of co-opt the politics of representation within the SDG agenda, right? And the UN basically, in the sense, is aligned with the World Bank in that sense, and they're not disputing it, and they're relying on the World Bank produced data, except when it comes to UN departments that are leading in certain data creation, like UN population statistics. I mean, I think the World Bank relies on the UN in that sense, but when it comes to poverty measures, the World Bank the UN, as far as I can see, almost entirely relies on the World Bank production of data, right? So there's that on one hand. The SDG has not challenged that and goes along with that dominant narrative of how we're actually in a period of wonderfully progressive change since 1990, and it's just about deepening the progress, right, and extending the progress. And then on the other hand, there's, I think, I mean, this is what I wrote in a couple of papers leading up to the SDG. Well, one paper in particular leading up to the SDGs, is the fact that they don't, like with the MDGs, there's simply naming the issue doesn't solve the extremely politicized debates on how to address the issue, right? And then that's where the statistical representation feeds into, how we understand a problem exists and how to address it, right? So, and that's where it needs to be brought back to broader debates in development policy, whereas, how did the few successful developing countries actually manage to become successful developing countries? Was it through the standard, policy rule book that's being promoted, or was it through things that are obviously have their problems, are dirty, and they often involve suppression of labor rights and so on, but industrial policy in the case of South Korea and Taiwan, and the fact that even now it's very difficult to talk about industrial policy as a serious, a national industrial policy, as opposed to industrial policy in the support of multinational corporations using sort of value chains and so on. Or the nationalization of finance or state-owned banks, the fact that South Korea, Taiwan, and China all basically have nationalized financial systems, right? State-owned, even to a large degree, through the key moments of development, which allowed them then to direct finance for developmental purposes, right? As opposed to where profitability wasn't an issue, versus basically the foreign ownership of most of the banking sector in Africa. Now Ethiopia is one of the last standing countries, but now they're talking about liberalizing their financial sector. So, I mean, it doesn't, it brings us back to, okay, so how are the poverty representations being fed into these types of debates? If you just say Africa was a basket case up until 1980, and then since then it's been a model of progressive, complicated, with tensions, problems, and so on, but basically, especially since the 1990s, a gradual, tempered success story, and hence structural adjustment in the end was good, and let's keep doing more of it, then you get a completely different picture of reality, right? Which is ongoing now. I mean, Pakistan just agreed with the IMF, it was announced yesterday, on a $6 billion loan program. And as part of that, they want to have a free-floating exchange rate. And also they say that they're going to try and protect although there will be, I quoted it on my Twitter account, but there will be adjustments, but we will try and prevent the poorest from being hurt, right? Which is what they said in the 80s. And but the issue there is usually that's a code word for very narrowly targeted social protection, cash transfers. The Benazir Bhutto cash transfer program, the Benazir, I can't remember the exact formal title, but I mean, Stephen Kidd from Development Pathways, for instance, has shown it's one of the most horribly performing cash transfer programs in terms of the effectiveness of targeting, where the exclusion errors are like 92%, meaning that of the people it's meaning to target, most of them aren't there, right? It's extremely ineffective targeting mechanism. But if this is the approach of trying to make sure that the poor are being protected from the broader adjustments in the economy when you're liberalizing the exchange rate, imports probably double in price, and who knows what else happens. And then the code word is, yes, we're going to take care of the poor through targeted cash transfers, which are horribly functioning devices. It becomes very, you see what I mean? We have to have those discussions in the SDGs, right? But if you just produce statistics that show that poverty has declined by 10% in Pakistan over the last 20 years, based on some extremely minimalist measure of poverty, that's arguably is probably underestimating poverty over time, then you will say, well, okay, fine, we'll take the blows now, but we keep staying on course, and we'll just keep following that gradual, progression in that sense, right? So this is where the poverty representations become so important in that sense. I mean, I don't know. I hope I've been convincing. Read the book. I think it's more articulate than my speech, but.
Other questions, comments?
So you mentioned this conflict between the identification of needs versus the identification itself being used as a segregation tool.
Yeah.
So how could we tackle, for instance, these attempts to lead to social justice without undermining them, like quotas, for instance?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll my own positionality, as we say, I think, my own biases, I'm very much in support of universalistic approaches to social policy as central to address that question. And I do think they are possible to implement in poor countries. I think we have to widen our imagination and get beyond the Scandinavian model, so to speak, to imagine, which Tandika Makandare's work, I think, does very effectively, of thinking about how we can conceive of universalistic approaches even in very poor contexts. And definitely that the successful development experiences of the second half of the 20th century also show that very broad-based universalistic approaches to health, education, in particular, have been core, and things like land reform, egalitarian measures, redistributive measures, and so on, have been core to a lot of their development experience. Perhaps not social protection per se, as in Korea, Taiwan, and China are often portrayed as being more relying till quite of a late stage on familial approaches to social welfare and social protection, social insurance, as in relying on the family and not really having a well-developed social protection mechanism. But definitely in health and education, they were very universalistic right off the bat from a very poor level, right? And I think the key thing there is that, and we can go to the work of Theda Skocpol, for instance, where she talks about targeting within universalism. I think this is where I think the whole discussion, I discussed this in chapter 7, I think my one critique of the targeting versus universalism debate is I think it got off track a bit, in the sense that, you know, to a certain degree, yes, you always will need targeting, especially in social protection. And the issue is not about the issue is not about targeting as a specific policy tool, but it's within a broader modality of social provisioning within which the way you organize the system is to segregate the system between different groups and then try and target people into one part of the system versus other parts of the system. And so, of course, what Theda Skocpol was arguing was more that you know, you can have a universalistic system that then uses within the universalistic system targeting mechanisms to try and address disadvantage, discrimination, and so on. I mean, the best example of that is like in a schooling system. If you have special needs in a schooling system, it's much easier to address special needs in a schooling system when you have a unified, organized schooling system that attempts to also redistribute and create somewhat egalitarian and equal equality standards across the education system as much as possible, because there's always streaming in schooling systems and so on. It's much easier within a unified, organized system like that to then identify and address special needs than it is if you have several parallel education systems running almost autonomously from each other, and where it's very difficult then to manage quality standards across the education systems, for instance, right? And then where different populations are accessing education with very different quality standards. And then how do you then target special needs within that type of system, right? So it's a systemic approach to understanding social provisioning as opposed to, you know, in this particular program, do I target or not, right? The meaning of targeting, the effects of targeting, the implications of targeting are entirely different based on how it's integrated within a system, right? And it's that system, it's within that system that you identify the segregation, not within the policy tool itself, right? That would be, I suppose, my response, right? So, I mean, even in very poor countries, this question is, do you design your, I mean, obviously you're here and you want to get there and there's like massive distance in between, but can you design your next evolution of healthcare reforms that leads you towards a more universalistic direction, or that reinforces segregation within the system, right? Or same with social protection. Do you try and unify social assistance, so to speak, with the formalized social security system, or do you just throw your hands up in the air and you say it's impossible, and you just separate out those two, and you actually, which is what's happening. I mean, the dominant, the World Bank and the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, they're very much pushing cash transfers, these very minimally targeted, quite thin forms of social protection, while simultaneously advocating for the form of the formal social security system, saying that it's too generous, it's inegalitarian, it's reinforcing inequalities because the rich people are getting super generous pension benefits and so on. And we have to scrap all of that or reform it massively and take the savings and put it into targeting towards poor people, right? So you're lowering the standards down to the minimal level rather than trying to bring up the social protection, social assistance system to a more, higher quality level, right? I mean, you see that, for instance, in the first years of the Correa government in Ecuador, for instance, one case that we're studying now in our project. So I'm going on. The government, in the initial years, they had this objective of trying to unify the social assistance and social security system to try and, like the way the Costa Rican model, for instance, of trying to create it where it's more organized so the people are part of the same system, and hence then you can move gradually towards a point where they're basically being treated the same, integrated within one system. But they gave up within about a year or two of government. This was the New Left in Latin America, and then they basically just retreated back to completely treating the two systems completely differently, right? And isolating the way they treat the poor from the way they treat the sort of top 20 or 30% of the population. So was that answering your questions, or, I mean, I was supposed to keep it short. I was told by what's her name, to make sure you keep all your comments very short, because it's supposed to be a conversation. But
while we wait for another comment or question, I just want to follow up a bit on that, because I mean, you talk about sort of universalism and targeting and these kind of things as if they were disaggregated in a sense from global politics at the very I want to say base level at the moment. I mean, you have now the rise of a populist right wing globally. You could say, look to India, look to Brazil. Could you not say that the kind of targeting that is now proposed by the World Bank or the IMF, in a sense, supports the kind of xenophobic, sometimes racialized, sometimes culturalized, sometimes ethnicized politics against the poor or against marginal groups that you see in those countries? I'm thinking, for instance, of Bolsonaro, and what he proposes now in terms of the population in the Amazon who are like Brazilians waiting to become Brazilians. And therefore we should target them not as something special, but as help them back into the national fold, for instance. So targeting, in a sense, can have the sort of the doubling up effect on the kind of the right wing populist dynamics. That's what I wanted to ask you. Or do you see those connections at all?
No, I see those connections, and I think there's a lot of work for critical social policy scholarship to address these types of connections as well, or critical sociology or critical social science scholarship altogether. I think, and I think that's what I'd like to see more of, and I would like to try and cultivate more of. But I mean, to be fair, I don't think your average sort of, if we use the term mainstream economist or World Bank economist, I think they are. I mean, I think they're liberal. They're liberal. The outlook is broadly liberal in the sense that they they would be opposed to these.
Of course,
these things. They do. I mean, I think like everyone else, they see these things emerging with a degree of horror. But that being said, I think there is a critique that a lot of the policies that have been implemented have been encouraging these things, right? Either by the degree to which they exacerbate social dislocation, or the way they segregate populations, they undermine cross-class solidarities, or also, I mean, just also the. I mean, it is all very political as well at the same time. I mean, apparently I was talking to Brazilians about, and they were saying one of the radical things, of course, Dilma did that turned a lot of middle-class, people against her, was just basically much more radical than Lula, enhancing rights of, say, domestic workers, for instance, who would then come into the house and say, well, I actually have the right to have weekends and and have a work day that's has a beginning and end and so on. And then you'd have people getting like this critical Brazilian sociologist doing studies of this, how just the simple things like that created so much like upset among what we would call middle classes in Brazil in that sense. So there are these dimensions, but of also what's driving the right wing that's not related to targeting and so on. But I do think there's, I also think there's, I guess, maybe this would be the better way of responding to it, is that there is a, if we think of poverty only as its most absolutist form, its absolute core, and then maybe we can see some declining poverty as an expression of, the reducing scarcity of food, for instance, or something like that. And we don't have an appreciation of how basically how much higher up, way above the poverty line, you can have types of social needs and pressures that can cause political reactions across the social hierarchy at much higher levels among the non-poor, right? And so how we conceive, because the problem I think with the way we understand poverty and vulnerability, for instance, is we associate, and this is what I've said about social exclusion as well, because I have my whole chapter on social exclusion discusses this actually. I haven't said much about this, but social exclusion, I've criticized it a lot because most definitions of social exclusion treat it as poverty in another name. And I think a lot of the vulnerability studies also more or less treat vulnerability as poverty. And the problem with that is that if we take that approach to understanding exclusion or vulnerability or other types of things, we can't then understand, with that lens, we can't understand how various forms of social dislocation cause vulnerability and exclusion at higher levels of the social hierarchy, where people are also interacting with their reference group, not necessarily with the poor, right? So for instance, in my studies in the Tibetan areas, up until before the protest in 2008, I was, to a certain degree, I mean, I don't want to make a claim to fame, but I was predicting, it was pretty obvious being in the field, but that where a lot of the grievance that was leading to a lot of these protests in the Tibetan areas, for instance, were from among a lot of these first-generation, university-educated young Tibetan people in this huge surge, going into universities, coming out of the universities, facing urban labor markets, at a level not among the poor people, not among the sort of the laboring migrants and so on, but in sectors of employment that were in accordance with their levels of education. And then at those levels, they were facing intense competition from equally educated migrants from outside and so on. And you could not understand any of that, those processes of exclusion and grievance and conflict and so on through a lens of poverty, even multidimensional poverty, right? So if you define vulnerability and exclusion as poverty, you completely are blind to all this stuff happening throughout the social hierarchy that's as equally as important. And that can then generate all sorts of reactions and responses and so on, and displacements, people's sense of grievance or anger from displacement in a social hierarchy as well is much more intense among the middle classes than it is among the poor, right? So in a context of rising inequality, I mean, if you think of it statistically, right? But if you think of income distribution like this, right? In very simple terms, when it becomes a taller, steeper mountain, it means the population is actually becoming less unequal, more equal, because more people are in the center and less on the outsides, right? So inequality is represented as when you have increasing inequality, is represented as a flattening of the distribution, right? So the people on the people on either ends, the people who are at the bottom, don't experience a downward shift in the social hierarchy. They experience pressures from above, but the people who experience the most dislocation in the social hierarchy are the ones in the middle, right? Who are displaced downwards, basically, in a process of rising inequality and polarization and so on. And so I think a lot of this rising resentment among, and this goes back, it's a very Polanyian, Karl Polanyi or Hannah Arendt also made a similar type of analysis of 1930s fascism, was very much, it wasn't among the working classes, it was very much among, what they characterize as the lower middle classes and provincial towns and so on, who were the ones who perhaps were not the most affected in poverty terms by the dislocations of the 30s, but were perhaps the most affected in terms of displacements into the social hierarchy, right? Who their relative social positions were being most challenged by the natures of social and economic dislocation, right? So yes, we do need to. I don't know. Did that? I mean, you were just forcing me to think out of the box there, but I mean,
yeah.
I hope it.
I'm very happy with that.
Yeah, you're happy with that?
We have time for one more question or comment, if there is any. Yes, Terra.
Thanks. Maybe this question is a bit outside the scope of your book.
Yeah.
But I wonder, gender is also an issue in poverty.
Yeah, no, of course.
And women has also been kind of a target in poverty strategies, saying that, and you have this feminization of poverty thesis with a number of 70% of the poorest of the poor are women, kind of, where you don't exactly know where this number comes from.
Yeah.
And also the instrumental role of that is presumed of women in poverty strategies, that if you fix the women, you will fix the world in a way.
Yeah.
To paraphrase Chant and Silverman. So do you have any thoughts about these kinds of assumptions about women in poverty strategies and how they kind of fare in...
No, totally, and I think it's very relevant. I mean, it's an extremely important question. I'm sorry I didn't address more of it. And I don't have a separate chapter on gender, partly because I didn't want to segregate gender off into a, as if... But I mean, what I was just talking about in terms of my understanding of social exclusion, for instance, was hugely influenced by people like Sam Jackson and Sylvia Chant in terms of their critiques of the feminization of poverty discourse. Sam Jackson, in particular, who says similar to the point I was just making about exclusion, which is that the whole feminization, the instrumentalization of gender within poverty studies has tended to, similar to social exclusion, define or reframe gender subordination or gender discrimination as poverty. And when you do that, you do a disservice to our understanding of gender and our understanding of equality struggles within gender as well, because a lot of the issues that cause sort of women's subordination, for instance, are not related to poverty. They could actually be exacerbated by movements out of poverty, right? And that's the point they make, and they provide a lot of evidence. So Sam Jackson in particular has done a lot of great work on that. So it's not about saying that the women in poverty are not important, but it's that we have to separate out the two issues. There's poverty, and then there's, gender inequality, gender subordination, and so on. And we have to treat the two issues as separately in that sense. To do justice, to adapt our policy responses to each separately. Because as you say, I mean, I think you said it perfectly, and I can only repeat what you said, which is that a lot of these poverty policies do instrumentalize women. Cash transfer programs in particular, the conditionalities of cash transfer programs have a huge amount of unpaid implicit labor inputs from women, assuming that poor people just have lots of free time, presumably, right? Because they're not working or something, whereas these people are often working from like 5 a.m. till like 11 at night, right? They, especially the women, because they have all the domestic labor that they have to take care of, in addition to often informal work in the labor market and so on. And I have several of my PhD students working on that. Also, I mean, there was, again, Steve Kidd with Development Pathways, they came out with one of their associates came out with a study. I was actually quite shocked to hear about this and amazed that no one has been talking about it so far, but the PSNP in Ethiopia, the Productive Safety Net Program, which has been celebrated by DFID and other development organizations and so on as being, more progressive than the traditional cash transfers, are actually based on a household system of, because it's a work program, so similar to the Mahatma Gandhi and Narega in India, employment guarantee scheme, where basically they'll provide work to poor families. And the big question there is are you providing enough relief to pay for the calories that the poor people spend in the work program to start with? But even if we assume that that's okay, they were actually pointing out that what happens is because the mechanism is that each family actually allocates labor to these work programs, what is essentially happening within a patriarchal household is they're allocating all the young women's labor to these work programs, and these women don't get paid for the work because the payment gets made to the household head, right? So you're actually, I mean, Stephen Kidd was being a bit radical saying it's a form of slavery, but it's effectively a very exploitative form of using women's labor on these programs and not paying them for their work. And yet there's a whole discourse of how this is empowering for women, right? Because they're working presumably, and so these types of things I think desperately need more research. And I think if I can encourage a whole generation of scholars to look at these types of things, along with my colleagues, then I think that would be a great outcome.
Great. I think that's a fantastically optimistic note to end on. So I want to thank you again, Andrew, for making the trip to Bergen and to presenting the book and discussing with me and the audience. And we actually have some copies of the book that you may approach Maria in the back here for afterwards. So thank you again and for coming.
Thank you. And thank you.